Okay, here we go. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for From Compliance to Confidence, Modern Identity Governance and Risk Management. So today's conversation is especially timely given that identity governance is no longer just about passing audits or completing a periodic access review. It's become central to how organizations protect business operations, financial integrity, and stakeholder trust. So as cloud environments expand and AI-driven workflows accelerate, along with non-human identities that are multiplying, traditional governance models are under pressure. So in this session, I'm thrilled to be joined by Michael Rasmussen and Adil Khan, who will explore how organizations can modernize identity governance into a federated risk-aware capability, one that supports continuous assurance, stronger audit readiness, and more confident business operations. So, Michael, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Certainly. I'm Michael Rasmussen. I'm an analyst. My job is research. I research what are the challenges companies face in the context of governance, risk management, and compliance, and how do they go about solving that with strategy, process, and technology. And in that context, I also have GRC Report, which is a global news website and governance, risk, and compliance news around the world. And I have my two podcasts, The Risk is Our Business podcast and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the GRC Technology Galaxy podcast, which I've had SafePaaS on.
Yep, you have. Adil?
Hi, Michael. Glad you could join us at this opportunity. I'm the founder and CEO of SafePaaS. We started this business back in 2017 and have this great success of helping many clients around the globe address their needs for better controls to manage risk, especially hidden risk that is hard to find in systems. And my experience prior to that is I was a CEO of a public company listed on NASDAQ and went through a lot of governance challenges and opportunities back in 2002 when Sarbanes-Oxley was introduced into the SEC reporting structure. And since then, I've been helping other companies around the world help improve internal controls, especially through the systems, such as their ERP systems and so forth. I've also written a book and presented on GRC worldwide over the past 20 years. And I'm really excited to talk about this very important topic today.
Excellent. It's wonderful being here to present alongside you on this topic. So I'll begin here. Again, welcome everybody, for joining us for today's discussion, whether you're on the live version or the on-demand version. But we call this From Compliance to Confidence, Modern Identity Governance and Risk Management. That title is intentional. For many years, identity governance has been approached primarily as a compliance requirement. We needed access reviews because auditors asked for them. We needed certifications because regulators required them. We needed evidence because controls had to be tested. That compliance lens is still important, but is no longer enough. Identity today is not just a security control, it's not just an IT administrative activity, it's not just some periodic audit requirement. Identity is now one of the core foundations of modern business operations. Every business process depends on identity. Every financial transaction depends on identity. Every system workflow or data access, third-party connections, your contractors, consultants, service providers, outsourcers, every cloud integration and service account, or now bots and AI agents introduces identity questions that have to be governed. The question is not simply, do we have access controls? The deeper question is, do we have confidence that the right identities have the right access for the right reason, at the right time, under the right controls, and with the right level of assurance? That is what we are going to explore today. We're going to talk about why the traditional model of identity governance is breaking down. We'll look at the expanding risk environment. We'll discuss how identity risk connects to operational resilience, financial integrity, fraud prevention, cyber risk, audit readiness, and of course, that ultimate theme, business trust and confidence. We'll then move into a modern identity GRC framework, and Adil will help us connect that framework to the practical capabilities required to make it real in the enterprise. But, again, from compliance to confidence, that phrase captures a necessary evolution. Compliance asks, did we complete the required activity? Confidence asks, can the organization trust that access is appropriate, risk is understood, controls are operating, the business can move forward safely. Compliance is often periodic or episodic. Confidence has to be continuous. Compliance often focuses on evidence after the fact. Confidence requires visibility and control before risk becomes loss. Compliance often sits in a department. Confidence has to be embedded across the enterprise. And this is especially true for identity governance. Identity governance used to be relatively contained. We had employees, internal systems, directories, access requests and approvals, periodic reviews. That world no longer exists. The modern enterprise is hybrid, digital, cloud-based, automated, outsourced, increasingly AI-enabled. Access is not just granted to employees, it is granted to contractors, suppliers, and service providers, applications and APIs and scripts and bots, and now autonomous or semi-autonomous AI agents. So the old model of identity governance as a periodic compliance exercise is inadequate, is what we're going to tell you. It is too slow, it is too fragmented, it is too reactive. It often tells us what went wrong after the exposure already existed. What we need instead is what I call identity GRC, a governance, risk management, compliance architecture for identity and access. It is an approach that aligns identity decisions to business objectives, addresses the uncertainty and risk that identity creates, ensures the organization acts with integrity across the regulatory, contractual, ethical, and operational obligations that it has. Today, we are going to unpack that. But let's set the broader context. The first thing we need to recognize is that the baseline of business today is instability. We often design governance programs as though the organization is stable. We create access models, role definitions, approval workflows, and review cycles, assuming that the organization will remain fairly consistent over time. But that assumption does not hold. Modern organizations are in constant motion. Employees join, leave, and change roles. Contractors rotate in and out. Business units reorganize, restructure. Applications are added. Cloud services are adopted. Third-party relationships expand, and they've got access to systems. In fact, one of the cyber incidents, the ransomware incidents I recently encountered, that a third party, a contractor, consultant, service provider role had system level access, and these hackers that got a hold that this contractor, this third party, had a significant online gambling debt and was extorting this third party to give them access to the systems, or they're going to expose this huge gambling debt to this person's family and friends. And so, I mean, there's a third party and access, and ransomware tied to it. We have also mergers and acquisitions that introduce new systems and identities. Regulatory expectations shift, and cyber threats, of course, evolved, and data moves across platforms, and AI tools are introduced into processes. And gosh, business leaders expect speed, agility, and digital transformation. This is the storm in the image. The enterprise is navigating uncertainty from every direction. In this environment, identity governance cannot be static. It cannot be based on annual or quarterly snapshots alone. It has to function like the lighthouse. It has to provide direction and visibility and assurance while the storm is happening. The organization needs to know continuously who has access, what do they have access to, why do they have that access, what business role process justifies it, what risk does that access introduce, if the access is the access being used appropriately, does it violate segregation of duties, does it create fraud exposure or sensitive data exposure, or does it remain appropriate after a role change, and does it belong to a person, a machine, a bot, a service account, or an AI agent? And when something changes, how quickly can the organization respond? That is the challenge. Identity governance has to operate in a business environment where instability is now the norm. The organizations that still treat identity as a periodic review process are trying to navigate a storm by looking at last quarter's weather report. That is not enough. Identity GRC, or what we call identity governance to simplify it, must be designed for continuous change. Adil, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm spending a lot of time with our clients that are examining some of the points you just made, especially around non-human identities. So that's been top of my mind as we come into this webinar today on how to help our clients protect against this unstable, I guess, environment, as you have rightfully pointed out here. And it is a major challenge. And so I'll talk a little bit later about lines of defense and how we address it. But that's one thought I wanted to just pitch in here, that the folks that are listening to today's webinar or the recording should specifically look at it. The reason I mention that is because I consider that as a high velocity risk. It's moving fast. It's coming at us, and many organizations are surprised. There's a lot of shadow IT going on. There's a lot of excitement around AI. And so your data and your secrets are more at risk today than they ever have been in my 30 years of helping customers protect their systems.
That's some excellent insight. And that actually goes to my next slide. A chain with one weak link, that is a useful metaphor because identity risk often starts with that single weak point. Like that example I used with one of the big ransomware events last year, where it was a contractor, third party with system level access that had a significant online gambling debt that was being extorted. That weak link. A weak identity link may look small at first. It may be one account that was not disabled, one privilege entitlement that was never removed, one contractor who retained access after a project ended, that service account no one owns, a user with access to both create and approve a vendor, one AI agent with authority to modify data. To modify data, it should only have access to read. But weak identity links create real organizational exposure. From a cyber perspective, attackers look for weak identity links. They look for dormant accounts, overprivileged users, compromised credentials, poorly governed service accounts, and gaps between systems. From a fraud perspective, weak identity links allow individuals or automated processes to bypass controls, manipulate transactions, change master data, or approve activities that should require independent review. From an audit and compliance perspective, weak identity links create evidence gaps, control failures, segregation of duties, violations, and unresolved exceptions. From that operational resilience and continuity perspective, that weak identity link can disrupt business processes. If access is not governed properly, the wrong person may have access, the right person may not have access, and continuity may suffer. This is why identity is more than a technical concern. Identity is a business risk. The organization has to understand identity risk in terms of business impact. What could go wrong if this identity has this access? What transaction could be executed? What data could be exposed? What control could be bypassed? What obligation could be violated? What operational dependency could fail? That is the mindset shift from traditional identity governance to what I call identity GRC, identity governance, risk, and compliance. Traditional identity governance says, let us review access. The broader perspective says, let us understand and govern the risk that access creates in the business. That is much more powerful, and it's the necessary framing that we're providing in this webinar. Now, identity risk now exists across a digital ecosystem. It is not contained within a single directory, application, or internal network. The modern enterprise operates across cloud platforms, SaaS applications, ERP systems, procurement platforms, finance systems, HR systems, customer platforms, data lakes, APIs, robotic process automation, third parties, and AI-enabled tools. Each of these environments has identities. Each has access. Each has permissions with data, and all that has business consequences. The more connected the enterprise becomes, the more identity becomes the control point. We can think about this in terms of several layers. There's the human identity layer, employees, managers, executives, administrators, contractors, consultants, and other third parties. There's the non-human identity layer, service accounts, API keys, scripts, bots, robotic process automation, machine identities, and system integrations. There is now the AI identity layer, AI agents and AI-enabled workflows that may retrieve information, recommend actions, execute tasks, or interact with systems. Then there is the business process layer, procure to pay, order to cash, record to report, hire to retire, source to contract, financial close, customer onboarding, third-party onboarding, and many other processes. Identity governance has to connect all of those layers. The problem is that many organizations still govern identity in fragments. IT may own provisioning, security may own privileged access, finance may own segregation of duties, audit may test controls, compliance may define policies, HR may trigger onboarding and offboarding, business managers may approve access, application owners may maintain roles, but the organization may not have a unified view of identity risk. That fragmentation creates blind spots. One system may show that access was approved, another may show that the access creates a control conflict, still another, out there may show that the user changed roles, and somewhere else it shows that a transaction was executed, or that the account was inactive, or that the identity belongs to a third party or bot. And those facts are not all connected, the organization does not have confidence. It has fragments of evidence. Identity, governance, risk, and compliance is about connecting those fragments into an integrated picture. Adil, what are your thoughts on this whole ecosystem of identities?
I think the key points you've covered around the call it a scope creep or a blast radius of identity is the key point there, right? And so bringing it from a solution provider's perspective, what we are looking to do is, number one, is to really give our customers better visibility into what all this is that you very well articulated here on this slide. Identities are everywhere. They're also your most important security lever in the organization because we are hybrid, we are remote, we are global. All of those events and trends have created this need for identity to be the security layer to your data, secrets, and confidential information, transactions, etc. So that's like your top layer. So from a solution provider perspective, my key point here would be to start by assessing, do you even know all your identities? Let's say our typical client will have 10,000 to 20,000 identities, anywhere in between. I'm talking about critical identities, right? Some will have, on the outer limit would be 50 to 100,000. But on average, that's the number of identities we're dealing with. And that mishmash of just types of identities, the purpose, and the characteristics and privileges, as you mentioned, just starting with the inventory or the scan of that identity is step one. And so what I'm seeing is a growing demand for companies to really align and categorize what all they have. And it's a big task. So we're building solutions that makes it easier.
That's great. And so that provides a lot of the context. Now, I'd like to go on to this, that AI is introducing new identity risks, but also providing new value. Let me put this in the context of an analogy that my friend Tony Martin Viggy illustrates in his book, From Heat Maps to Histograms, on cyber risk quantification, that was just published. I recommend the book. Tony was the head of cyber risk at Netflix, and one of the leading experts in the world on cyber risk quantification. But he has this chapter on Gen AI and the subchapter on that, how AI is not data from Star Trek, but more like Jack Sparrow from the Pirates of the Caribbean. And a lot of people approach artificial intelligence as if it's data from Star Trek: The Next Generation, that android humanoid robot, that is, ethical, is working for you, reliable. And AI is not data from Star Trek. AI is much more like Jack Sparrow from the Pirates of the Caribbean, where he's a very brilliant, imaginative, creative, but Jack Sparrow is going to go on his own adventure and improvise. He needs governance. And that's why we need identity governance with artificial intelligence, because we need to make sure that, AI is properly controlled in the environment as well. Because AI does introduce tremendous value. It can improve decision-making and automate workflows and accelerate analysis and identify patterns and reduce manual effort, and overall support better governance, including identity governance. In many areas of GRC, AI is going to help organizations move faster and become more intelligent. But as I was just stating, AI also introduces new identity risk. It needs to be governed. It's Jack Sparrow. The identity question is no longer limited to human users. We now have to ask, what is the identity of the AI agent? What system can it access? What data can it retrieve and actions can it take? Who authorized it? Who owns it? How is it monitored? What policies apply? How do we know it is acting within approved boundaries? This is especially important as organizations move from AI that simply assists a person to AI that acts on behalf of a person, a function, or a process. Think about a procurement process. An AI assistant might help summarize supplier risk. That is one level of risk, but an AI agent that can update supplier records, change payment terms, or modify bank account information introduces a very different level of risk. Or consider finance. An AI system that helps analyze anomalies is one thing. An AI agent that can initiate journal entries, approve reconciliations, or trigger payments is quite another thing. Or we can come at it from the compliance role. An AI tool that summarizes regulatory obligations is useful, but an AI agent that updates controls, modifies policies, or submits attestations needs governance. This is why AI makes identity governance more important, not less. The organization must govern both the identity and the authority of AI-enabled actors. It must define what these identities are allowed to do, what they are not allowed to do, how their actions are logged, how expectations are escalated, and how humans remain accountable. This is where the concept of least privilege becomes more complex. It is no longer just least privilege for employees. It is least privilege for machines and applications and data flows, bots and AI agents. And we also have to think about the data side. If an AI model or AI agent has access to sensitive data, the organization must know whether that access is authorized, whether it is necessary, whether it violates privacy or contractual requirements, and whether the data can be used for training or inference. So AI creates a dual challenge. It creates new identity risks, but also creates new opportunities to improve governance. AI can help detect anomalies, identify access conflicts, recommend remediation, summarize risk context, and support continuous monitoring. The key is that AI itself must be governed. AI without identity governance increases risk. AI with identity governance can increase confidence. So too much of identity governance, from my perspective, is looking in the rearview mirror. Organizations often discover identity risk after the fact. Access was granted months ago, a user changed roles weeks ago, a contractor left the organization but retained access, a segregation of duties conflict existed for an entire quarter, a privileged account was used outside normal patterns, an audit finding revealed that a control was not operating, a breach investigation found that an account shouldn't have been disabled. This is rearview mirror governance. Now, the rearview mirror is useful in your car. We need evidence, we need historical records, we need audit trails, we need to know what happened. We cannot govern modern identity risk only by looking backwards. The phrase in the mirror is telling. Objects may be closer than they appear. Identity risk is often closer than leadership realizes. The exposure is not theoretical. It is already in the environment. It is in the access model. It is in the exception queue or the orphaned account or the excessive privilege or the unmanaged service account. It is that AI agent that was connected quickly to solve a business problem. Modern identity governance has to shift from retrospective review to proactive and continuous assurance. That means we need earlier detection, we need risk-based access decisions at the point of request, we need preventive controls embedded into business processes, we need continuous monitoring of access and activity, we need that rapid escalation and automated evidence and closed-loop remediation. The organization needs headlights, not a rearview mirror. A mature identity governance program gives the organization visibility into what is ahead, not only what has happened in the past. And here I have my quote from the physicist Friedrich Capra. The more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are interconnected and interdependent. Identity risk is exactly that kind of problem. Identity is connected to nearly everything in the enterprise. It connects to HR because HR defines who a person is, what role they have, when they join, and when they move, and when they leave. It connects to IT because IT provisions systems, manages directories and integrations, and supports access infrastructure. It connects to security because identity is a major attack surface, or finance because access determines who can execute transactions, approve payments, and change master data, or even override controls. Or procurement because third-party suppliers, contractors, and external users require access. From the compliance because regulatory and contractual obligations define what must be controlled. And then you have the role of audit and assurance because access controls must be tested in evidence. And of course, risk management because identity risk can produce operational, cyber, financial fraud, privacy, and compliance impacts. It connects to business operations because employees and systems need access to get work done. This is why fragmented identity governance fails. Each function sees part of the picture. HR sees employment status, IT sees tickets and access, security sees authentication and threats. But identity risk emerges from the connections between these areas. A user may have access that appears acceptable to IT, but creates a conflict in finance. A contractor may appear active in a project system, but should have been removed from an ERP role. An AI agent may improve process efficiency, but introduces unauthorized access to sensitive data. That is why identity governance has to be systemic. It has to connect people, process, technology, risk controls, policies, obligations, and evidence all together. It has to create an enterprise view of identity and access. The goal is not to centralize every decision into one department. That would create bottlenecks. The goal is a federated model with consistent governance, shared context, clear accountability, and integrated assurance. Identity governance is systemic governance for a systemic risk. Which brings me to my Titanic metaphor, and it's very relevant for identity governance. Captain Smith's quote reflects confidence, but it was confidence without sufficient awareness of the full risk environment. That is the danger. Many organizations have confidence in their identity governance program because they have visible controls. They have access requests approved workflows. They have quarterly certifications. They have privileged access tools and audit reports and policies and dashboards. But the critical question is, are they seeing the full iceberg or only part above the waterline? The visible part of identity governance may look fine. Access reviews are completed, managers click approve, tickets are closed, evidence is stored, audit receives reports. But below the surface, there may be excessive access, dormant accounts, orphaned identities, unmanaged surface accounts. This is the hidden massive identity risk. The problem is not that the organization has no controls. The problem is that the controls often lack context, continuity, and integration. So that's the iceberg problem. Modern identity governance requires deep visibility. It requires organizations to ask what identities exist, which identities are human or non-human, who owns those identities, and so much more. I've been through this. I don't need to get into it. But awareness is the first step towards confidence. Without awareness, governance becomes assumption, and assumption is not assurance. But that all brings us to, the complexity and chaos of where things are right now today. The Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California has 160 rooms, 47 fireplaces, 6 kitchens, 10,000 windows, doors that open to walls, abandoned staircases, skylights and floors. It had 147 builders, no architects, and no blueprint, no design. That is how many identity governance environments evolved. They were not designed as a coherent architecture. They were accumulated. One business unit added an application, another implemented a workflow, another created local roles, another added exceptions. A merger brought in another whole identity structure. A contractor model was added, privileged access tool was implemented. Gosh, it becomes a mess over time. The identity environment becomes the mystery house, like the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California. That it doesn't make sense. This is the critical point. Identity governance cannot mature simply by adding more controls to the mystery house. Organizations need an architectural blueprint. That blueprint should define the identity lifecycle from onboarding through offboarding, the role model and access model, the relationship between business roles, technical entitlements and risks, the approval and certification process, segregation of duties, controls, monitoring, integration with ERP and HR and other systems, evidence and reporting requirements, exception handling. Without that architecture, organizations end up maintaining a complexity instead of governing risk. Identity governance is about moving from the mystery house to a governed architecture. It gives the organization a blueprint, a control structure, and a way to continuously monitor whether the house is safe to occupy. So here's some of the practical challenges. This slide and some of the upcoming slides are from my illustration I designed with OSEG on identity governance and identity GRC, identity governance, risk and compliance, which we'll define in the next slide. But this really summarizes the practical challenges organizations face in identity and access management, particularly when processes remain manual, fragmented, and reactive. So let's just walk through these challenges because they are not isolated. They reinforce each other. The first challenge is lack of continuous identity monitoring and management. Many programs rely on periodic reviews, but identity risk changes daily. A quarterly review can miss months of exposure. In a dynamic business environment, delayed detection creates risk latency. The second challenge is complex business operations and access. Modern enterprises have hundreds or thousands of applications, global business units, regional variations, matrix roles, and shared services, and so much more. Simple access models do not reflect operational complexity. The third challenge is lack of holistic identity governance. Many organizations have pieces of identity governance, but not an integrated capability. They may have identity access management and access reviews and audit testing and compliance reporting, but these may not operate as one connected governance system. The fourth challenge is the heterogeneous systems and access. Access is spread across ERP systems, cloud platforms, SaaS tools, databases, legacy applications, and so much more. Each system has different roles, permissions, logs, and control capabilities. The fifth challenge is inconsistent identity risk management. Some access is risk-related, some is not. Some roles are reviewed carefully, others are rubber-stamped. Risk decisions vary across functions and systems. The sixth challenge is identity and access control failures. These failures can result in fraud, errors, data exposure, and audit findings. They are not abstract control issues. They affect the integrity of the business. The seventh challenge is manual and reactive processes for identity governance. Manual processes create delays, inconsistencies, and evidence gaps. They also frustrate the business. When governance creates friction without intelligence, people look for workarounds. That eighth challenge is identity lifecycle management inconsistency. Onboarding may be controlled, but roles change. Changes may not be. Terminations may be addressed in core systems, but not in every applications. And then you have the non-human identities that may be outside the lifecycle entirely. The ninth challenge is inadequate technology architecture. Integration, identity governance depends on integration. The 10th challenge is compliance issues and breaches. This is the outcome of the previous 9 challenges, with fragmentation, latency, inconsistency, and weak controls eventually becoming findings, incidents, and loss. The key point is this. These challenges are symptoms of a deeper structural problem. The problem is that identity governance is too often treated as a set of disconnected activities rather than an integrated GRC capability. An organization might say we have access reviews, but access reviews alone do not solve the problem. It might say we have provisioning workflows, but provisioning alone does not solve the problem. And I can go on, but the answer is that integrated identity governance, a unified approach to identities, access, controls, business processes, monitoring, remediation, evidence. This is the shift from fragmented compliance to operational confidence. I mean, Adil, I'll just jump in, have you jump in here. Do you relate to these challenges that I brought out in your clients?
Absolutely. This sounds like a laundry list that I hear every time I engage with a new client. They're pulling their hair out because, they've invested significant amount of time and effort, not to mention dollars, into protecting the identity, and they have processes in place. Well, I'll give you an example. I think you touched on it earlier slide about mergers and acquisitions. And you may have a one identity authorization system today. Let's say you're a large organization that hasn't moved to the cloud yet. So you may have some ADFS, which is the old legacy system, but you acquire a new startup to boost your customer value to your customers, and they're using the latest identity management system from let's say Okta or Microsoft or something like that. Now you've got a problem. Now you got to merge these organizations together, and how do you create a single identity store? And so there's been attempts, and unfortunately most of them have failed because it's just impossible to enable, let's say, single sign-on or other multi-factor authentication when you don't have the same source of truth. So it becomes a bigger problem that you're pointing out through all of these symptoms and the 10 key challenges you've identified. And it turns out that the root cause of a lot of this is that no one has a common understanding of identity. So there have been attempts to fix that by going, okay, let's go centralized. The centralized solutions have been tried over the last 20 years, and they have failed too, because it's very complex to centralize something that's so dynamic. So where we have landed and where we're seeing success, clients, you touched on it earlier, is this concept of federated identity governance, where you basically take the governance information that's out there across the enterprise and coalesce that in a way that transforms it. So let me give you a practical example of that. So let's say you're doing access reviews today. One of the things that's really important for someone that's reviewing access is to know information about the privileges that access grants to that identity. Also, some history about that access. For example, when was it granted, who granted it, and so forth. And sometimes it may be the person that granted it, but it's been 3 years and roles have changed, as you've pointed out. It's an unstable environment, right? So to address that, you have to now take data from multiple systems, from your identity source, from your HR source, from your maybe even an ERP system, if it's a privileged access that enables you to do sensitive transaction like supplier bank management and payments and so forth. So now you've got to create this federated identity picture, a view for the reviewer. And so that's where we see the solutioning to some of the problems you've highlighted here. But trying to simply solve these symptoms is impossible. So I think the key word that I've heard today that resonates with me, and I think it resonates with our clients, is it's got to be re-architected. And I know it sounds, when you say architecture, it sounds complex and costly, but there are ways that organizations that we work with have discovered how that can be done in a very transformative yet efficient way.
That's some excellent insight. So building on this, let's move from all the scary piece of this to how do we move towards a positive future for identity governance? And this is where I introduce identity governance as identity GRC. Identity GRC ensures the organization governance is the reliably achieves its identity and access governance objectives, and so that the business can achieve its objectives. Risk management, like ISO 31000, the international standard on risk, says risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So identity risk management addresses uncertainty that can undermine those objectives. Compliance acts with integrity within regulatory, contractual, and ethical requirements for identity and access. This is adapted from the OSEG GRC capability model for GRC itself, where GRC is the capability to reliably achieve objectives, address uncertainty, and act with integrity. I helped author that, going all the way back to 2004. And it's important because it reframes identity governance around the fundamental purpose of GRC. Governance is about objectives, making decisions, setting objectives. What is the organization trying to achieve with identity and access? It wants the right users and systems to have the right access to do their jobs. It wants business processes to operate efficiently. It wants employees, contractors, and systems to be productive. It wants digital transformation to move quickly, or it wants AI adoption to create value, and it wants access to support the mission of the business. Risk management comes in and is about uncertainty. What could prevent those objectives from being achieved? Excessive access could create fraud. Inadequate access could slow operations. Poor offboarding could create cyber exposure. Unmanaged service accounts then could become attack paths. AI agents could access data or perform actions outside approved boundaries. Segregation of duty conflicts could undermine financial integrity. And compliance is about integrity itself. What obligations must the organization meet? These may include regulatory requirements, include standards, contractual commitments, internal policies, audit expectations, and more. Identity GRC brings these together. This is a major shift in thinking. Identity governance is not simply the process of granting and reviewing access. It is the capability to govern identities in alignment with business objectives and requirements. That means identity decisions should not be made in isolation. It is a structure that allows the organization to move from we completed the certification to we have confidence that identity risk is governed. But this actually requires what is my favorite slide in the deck, orchestration. Identity governance is not a single instrument. It is an orchestra. HR is one instrument, IT is another, security is another, finance, audit. These are all sections of the orchestra, the violins, the violas, the cellos, the bass. But if every instrument plays independently, the result is noise. The organization may have activity, but not harmony, may have controls, but not assurance. Identity governance provides orchestration. It ensures that the identity lifecycle is coordinated from beginning to end. It connects onboarding, access requests, approvals, and so much more. It also coordinates accountability. The business owns the need for access. IT enables access. Security protects access. Compliance defines obligations and audit and all these. A mature identity governance program does not eliminate distributed ownership. It clarifies it. This is important because some organizations think better governance means centralizing everything. That is usually not realistic. Modern organizations are too complex, too distributed, and too fast moving for every access decision to be controlled by one central team. Instead, what we need is federated governance. That means distributed decision-making within a consistent architecture. That is orchestration. It turns fragmented activity into coordinated governance. Here's some slides for my illustration. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. If you're on this phone, you probably know this whole process by heart. But the first major capability in this identity governance GRC model is ongoing context monitoring. This is foundational because identity decisions are only as good as the context behind them. Access is not inherently good or bad in isolation. Its appropriateness depends on context. For example, access that is appropriate for someone in finance may be inappropriate for someone in procurement. Access that is acceptable in a development environment may be unacceptable in production. You know the picture. This is where identity governance becomes dynamic. Traditional identity governance often asks, does this user still need access? Modern identity governance asks, given the current business and risk context, is this access appropriate, controlled, monitored, and aligned to objectives? That's a deeper and richer question. It also allows the organization to prioritize. Not all access carries the same risk. A risk-aware program focuses attention where it matters most. privileged access, financial transaction authority, sensitive data. Ongoing context monitoring gives the organization the intelligence layer required to make identity governance meaningful. Without context, access reviews become checkbox exercises. With context, identity governance becomes risk-aware decision-making. The next capability is identity and provisioning. Provisioning is often thought as an operational workflow. Someone requests access, someone approves it, IT provisions it, and the ticket is closed. But identity GRC, provisioning is a governance decision. Every access grant should answer several questions. What is the purpose of this identity? The role and responsibility? Does it justify the access? And so much more. Well, take an example. A contractor joins a project for 6 months. In many organizations, the contractor receives access through a request process. But what happens after the project ends? Is access automatically removed? Is the contractor's access limited to the project scope? And so much more. Now, we can go on with so many different things, and I want to make sure we get through the slides. But provisioning has to address these questions at the beginning, not after the fact. This is why, here we reference an identity control plan. A mature identity governance program defines the controls that should apply based on identity type, role, access, process, regulatory, and policy requirements. Provisioning should be intelligent. It should not just route a request. It should evaluate risk before access is granted. That is how organizations reduce downstream remediation. The better the decision at the front door, the fewer issues appear during certification, audit, and incident response. The third aspect is access communications and attestations. This is an area where many organizations have processes, but not always effectiveness. Access certification is often one of the most frustrating parts of identity governance. Managers receive long lists of users and entitlements. The descriptions are technical, the business meaning is unclear, the risk context is limited, the deadline is short. The easiest path is just click on the approve. That creates the illusion of governance. The review was completed, but was it meaningful? The purpose of attestation is not to get a manager to click a button. The purpose is to establish accountability and assurance that access remains appropriate. This is especially important for business managers who are not technical experts. If the certification process presents only cryptic entitlement names, it is not fair to expect meaningful review. Modern attestation should be risk-based, where high-risk access should be receive more scrutiny, low-risk access can be streamlined. Privileged access, financial access, sensitive data, should be reviewed with greater rigor. It should also be continuous where appropriate. Not every review needs to wait for a quarterly campaign. Some events should trigger immediate reviews, such as role changes or termination notices. Communication is also important. Identity governance involves multiple stakeholders. Managers, application owners, data owners, and all need to be part of the process. The objective is to move from passive certification to active governance. Instead of asking, can you approve this list? We should ask, can you confirm that this access is appropriate, necessary, risk acceptable, and control? And then we've got the fourth capability of continuous monitoring assessment. And this is where things move beyond that periodic episode compliance. Periodic reviews are not enough because identity risk does not wait for the review cycles. Access has become inappropriate the day after certification. A user can change roles, a contractor can leave, a privileged account can be misused, a new conflict can appear, a service account can be compromised. You know the picture. But monitoring alone is not enough. Continuous monitoring must be connected to assessment and action. That's absolutely critical. Then it must be tracked to closure. This is where many programs struggle. They identify issues, but remediation lingers. A mature identity governance program creates a closed loop process from detect to assess to assign to remediate, validate, evidence, and report. That is continuous assurance. This is also where automation and AI can help. Automated monitoring can identify anomalies and conflicts. The goal is not just to have more alerts. The goal is to reduce exposure and improve confidence. The most important metric may not be the number of issues found, it may be the time from issue creation to issue resolution. And the fifth capability is identity management across the full life cycle. To evaluate, to terminate, and decommission. This is a critical area because identity governance often focuses more on granting access than removing it. Onboarding gets attention because the business wants people to be productive. Access requests gets attention because users need systems. But offboarding, termination, decommissioning, cleanup are often weak. That creates residual risk. And particularly even whether it's a third party or an employee, but now also a bot or AI agent is no longer needed. We need to be able to ensure there's proper decommissioning. And this is why lifecycle governance is central to identity governance. Evaluation should occur throughout the life cycle. Termination should be timely and complete. The organization should know what access must be removed and should verify that removal occurred. So Adil, you have some slides here specifically on SafePaaS. Can you walk us through this?
Yeah, that was an excellent overview of the approach that you outlined. It aligns very much how SafePaaS views the modern identity governance challenge and opportunities. So you mentioned architecture, and I love your example of that house in San Jose. Maybe we'll go visit that when we do our event in San Jose. So that's a practical way of explaining the problem, and the way we're solving is through a what we call a federated architecture for identity governance, where SafePaaS provides you that federation across all these islands of technology. So you have a data source of identities that's getting authenticated, that might be in your IDM system. It could be a directory structure. If you have legacy applications you're supporting through that, it may be the most modern Okta innovation that's in the market. In all cases, you need to bring that information in. And there are many applications that are dependent on that identity to allocate privileges, which is what lights up the business value, right? So you take these identities that are being authenticated through the authorization systems like the IDM and IAM systems, and then you essentially want to be able to provision privileges, assign them, attach them to those identities. And that's another challenge that the architecture needs to solve, a modern architecture like ours needs to solve. And that is to be able to distinguish between human and non-human identities, whether they're APIs, bots, etc. And so being able to recognize the privileges in a fine-grained way about those applications. And when I say applications, that's majority of the risk, but there's a higher impact risk actually that resides underneath these applications. That's the data risk. Many of these applications allow you to extract data through APIs. If you have like one of our typical clients, you may still have some data sources that are on premise. And so you may have, let's say, your maintenance system for your fleet and your on-premise, something you built or purchased a long time ago, but now you've got all your customer data sitting there. And so you not need to be able to protect that data. And for that, you may also need to protect the database and the operating system. If you move that to AWS, you have to then protect the identities that are available in AWS to get access to that legacy data that you've essentially moved to the cloud, but it's still a application that you control the database access, and therefore you have your own team. Maybe you've outsourced the maintenance to some outsource. So my key point on this architecture on the top left side of this architecture is that ERP systems, many other applications that gain access through identities need to be monitored as well. One thing that's behind the architecture here is your HCM source. So your HCM data, where users get triggered to what we call the JML process, joiner, mover, leaver process. That all gets triggered in a modern enterprise to ensure timely and complete control over identities from your HR system. So you have, let's say, a modern HR system like, let's say, pick Workday, SuccessFactors, something like that, or you have a legacy system that's on premise, let's say an SAP or PeopleSoft. All of those need to be part of your architecture because you can't go out there and say, okay, well, we're going to leave this solution truncated because we don't have the right way to connect to them. So you need a system that can connect to everything from flat files into your legacy on-prem systems to the most modern REST and SOAP APIs, etc., XML, JSON, different formats. So at SafePaaS, we built this architecture. That's the main point I want to get across the busy slide. But these are many examples of architecture and integration. So to borrow the term that Michael used earlier about describing identity GRC. It's an integrated identity governance system. And that's the point that resonated with us. That's why we wanted to share this with the folks that are listening here, that you need to have this, think of this as an integrated, and we call it federated platform, where it's aware of all the activities. I mentioned earlier HCM. Many organizations don't have that integrated fully, and so they're still doing some provisioning through ITSM systems. I'm working right now with a very large federal agency that is doing some orchestration through a legacy IGA, identity governance tool, but many other things are still not happening. For example, um, being able to figure out what about the identities that are getting provisioned through an ITSM system, like a ServiceNow, something like that. That's a reality. Sometimes it's even, I hate to say it, but even email and backup paper napkins, right? Because your senior executive comes down, they've just hired a audit or a McKinsey or some external firm, and the clock is ticking, and they have to go back to the board in 3 months and provide an update. And so they'll come down to the IT and say, I need these 15 identities created today, and do what you need to get them through the help desk. But I need these people productive over the next 3 months. So that's just the real world, right? And that's that point about instability in the organization. That is something we and our clients face every day, and we're here to help them address that. So integration with ITSM, integration with HCM, integration with your key applications or all applications, depending on your appetite for risk, and obviously identity sources like IDAM, IAM, and even legacy IGA solutions. So we see ourselves as that federating agent within the enterprise. That doesn't mean you have to go upgrade everything to the latest tools and spend, millions of dollars and tens of months, if not years, to do all that before you can see value. We like to produce the value immediately. And this federated architecture is very scalable, it's independent, it's very complete. That creates a higher value for the decision makers and the owners of identities in the enterprise, typically the CISO office that's engaged with us. Now on the right side, it talks about then what does that mean? Once you integrate everything, now you can achieve those objectives that Michael, you laid out earlier about the identity is not just a rear view mirror, it's about continuous monitoring and control over your identities. How are the privileges getting assigned? How are the identities getting created, terminated? Uh, and also, one of the things that we haven't talked a whole lot about here is policies. How are your policies getting enforced and embedded into this architecture? So we see policy as part of the architecture where management and senior management and board can say, okay, as an organization for us to function, let's say we're in a defense industry, right? We work with many defense manufacturing companies where even within their organization that's global, they have policies on data residency, which identities can see what data um, by country, by region. There's data sovereignty issues that are coming up as customers are thinking about opening up their data to AI. And so that is impossible to do. These bottlenecks are impossible to do unless you have an architecture that flexes with your business needs and is scalable for your business needs. So the last point I'll make here is, that context I talked about earlier. Once you create this architecture that you can see here, then you can provide your control owners, your reviewers of identities, a context of what they're looking at, which resonated with me when Michael, you talked about the, some roles are rubber stamped, essentially is how I interpreted that. Others are well understood. So there's inconsistency, and that creates that weak link that you talked about, right? And that's all it takes for cyber criminals to exploit your organization, and we want to help you prevent that. So architecture is the critical part, but the same token, architecture needs to be flexible and scalable to fit your organization. And the way you start doing that is by creating that integration points that are uh, uh, easily configurable and seamless. So this doesn't turn into a multi-year integration project. And we have done at SafePaaS, done that investment on behalf of our clients. So we include tools, transformation tools, which can create essentially identity lakes very quickly of all the security attributes and provide that visibility that I talked about earlier. So that's the first step. We want you to consider thinking about your identity challenge by starting with an architecture that is scalable and flexible and agile to move with your organization's changes. Next slide, please. So I've talked a lot about identity today, and that's the main focus, but I also want to open up and say that when you think about zero trust, which is the ultimate objective, if you think about the frameworks and the guidance that's evolved into whether you follow the NIST architecture or the ISO architecture, they all talk about a layered approach to risk management. So identity security is what today's focus is, and that's definitely the most important line of defense, right, facing the bad actors, and we need to protect that. But uh, once that intrusion occurs, or if there's insider threat, you also have to govern the transactions. And that's really important, even in a fast-paced world we live in, where even with all these monitoring tools, you will find from time to time that there's exposure. And maybe you're lucky nobody has exploited that. But in today's world, that's not sufficient. You need to be able to know, number one, what the exposure is. So I'll give you a practical example. Let's say in your procure to pay cycle, you've onboarded a new app, and it's it's a SaaS application from one of the top procurement vendors. But in your excitement of getting the app out and getting news to the board that we're saving so much money on procurement, you've given ample access to everybody, every employee, to do procurement. Now the SaaS player applies a patch because now you don't have control over patching your environment. So they introduce releases every quarter, and they release a patch where everybody that could view supplier and make payments or request requisitions, every employee should be able to access your purchasing system to make requisition requests. Now they're able to actually go and look at supplier bank accounts, and some of them can maybe even change the bank account. That's a real example that I've run into with clients. So now, even though you have done good job with identity security, you have exposed your organization unwillingly because of a technology uh, challenge or a bug, where you need to explain to your management and probably your auditors as well, what was the period of that exposure. Let's say this was discovered in 60 days. So the 60 days this exposure existed, what happened during that time? What's the impact of that exposure? So your traditional identity solutions will not be able to solve that problem. So you got to be able to go down to these other additional layers. I won't go through each one of them. We've got limited time. We're almost out of time. But please take a look at this and reach out to us if you want to understand how these lines of defense work all together. Data governance, and then your IT general controls that control change management as an example, your application controls like configurations and so forth. All of this makes up that multi-layered approach that is the kind of secret sauce of SafePaaS to protecting the enterprise against emerging risks in the market today.
Some excellent insight there. I think you have one more slide right here.
Yeah, just an example slide. I'll close on this by saying that we talked a lot about visibility and transactions and so forth. So we want to bring all this data in a manner that management can quickly not only just monitor it, but maybe take actions like identifying when exposures occur, what's the impact? Did this risk materialize? If it materialized, how does that adversely affect our business? Some auditors use the term look back analysis. So all that's baked into our lines of defense. So the identity is protected, but if there are any gaps, that those gaps are protected as well through these layers of technology controls. So yeah, that's my final comment. Emma, Michael, I'll turn it back to you guys.
Well, I just have one last slide here that when we measure the value of identity governance, it's more than just ROI and making things more efficient. That's important. Certainly hard dollar benefits or euros or pounds, wherever you are in the world, matter. Efficiency is important, but also identity governance is about measuring that value of confidence, risk reduction, less exposure, the resilience, and the agility through all this. So to me, building a business case, I work on a lot of business cases and measure value of solutions like SafePaaS, but the efficiency is just one aspect, and even not the most important aspect. It's the one we most often focus on is how does this solution and approach save me time and money? But the even bigger question is how does it help me reduce risk exposure and enable the business? And that can be quantified. Like Hubbard's book, everything's quantifiable. But with that, I've got my sort of thank you slide here on this whole thing and that we've been through in the last hour. And then SafePaaS has theirs as well. And I'll turn this back over to Emma to close us out.
Yeah, I just want to say a huge thank you to you, Michael Rasmussen. Your insight has been fantastic as always. And a huge thank you to Adil for sharing such valuable insight to everybody who's joined us today. So the key takeaway is clear, right? Identity governance can no longer remain just a compliance checklist. It must become continuous, risk-aware, a risk-aware capability that helps organizations operate with confidence. So thank you to everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you again next month.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Adil.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.